She whispered a name in her sleep that stopped me cold in the doorway, a name I had not heard spoken out loud in 4 years. A name that belonged to a chapter of my life I had closed so completely I had almost convinced myself it had never been written. I stood there in the dark hallway of my own ranch house with a lantern in my hand and the winter wind pushing against the walls and my heart doing something I had no clean language for, and I thought, who is this woman, and what does she know, and how in the world did she end up on my land in the middle of a snowstorm with that name living somewhere inside her? That was the beginning. That was the moment before everything changed. And if you want to understand what came after, you have to understand what came before, the whole of it, the long and careful and quietly painful before, because nothing that happened between me and Margaret Ellis makes any sense without the ground it grew in. My name is Callum Reed. I am 34 years old. I own a cattle ranch in the high desert country of northern New Mexico, 612 acres of red rock and dry grass and sky that goes on longer than seems reasonable. A place so remote that my nearest neighbor is 11 miles by dirt road, and the nearest town of any consequence is 35 miles further than that. I came here at the age of 28 with a specific and deliberate intention to build something quiet. Something that asked nothing of me except work and honesty, and the willingness to show up every day regardless of weather or mood or the particular shape of whatever I was carrying. The land did not require me to explain myself. The cattle did not have opinions about my history. The sky over the mesa at 4 in the morning was the same sky whether I was whole or broken, and I found over the years that there was a profound and unexpected comfort in that indifference. I had not always lived quietly. That is the part of the story I will tell you because it matters, because the name Margaret whispered in her sleep was part of that louder life, and you need to know its weight before you can understand why hearing it in the dark stopped me where I stood like I had walked into a wall. I grew up in Colorado, oldest of three, son of a rancher father who taught me everything practical and a mother who taught me everything else. I was not a difficult child. I was not a troubled teenager. I was by most measures a person who moved through the world with reasonable ease. I was good at school, good at work, good at the social performance of being fine when I was not entirely fine. I learned early that the performance was often accepted in place of the reality, and that accepting the performance was easier for most people than engaging with the reality. And so I offered the performance and kept the reality close and private and mostly to myself. I knew what I was from the time I was 17. I did not have a name for all of it immediately. The names came later gradually, through the kind of slow self-education that happens when you are a person who reads and pays attention, and is willing to sit with discomfort long enough for it to become clarity. What I knew at 17 was simpler than names. I knew that the way I felt about people did not sort cleanly along the lines that the world around me seemed to expect it to. I felt what I felt about who I felt it about, and the gender of the person had less to do with it than the specific quality of their presence, their honesty, their particular way of being in the world. I did not announce this. In the ranching community I grew up in the Colorado of my childhood, there was not a lot of space for announcements of that kind. I kept it the way I kept other things, close, private, handled alone. The name that Margaret whispered was Jessie. And Jessie was the person who had taught me at the age of 26 that keeping things private has a cost and that the cost is sometimes the thing you were trying to protect. Jessie Crane, I will not tell that whole story here because it is not the stories to hold, but I will tell you enough. Jessie was a woman, sharp and funny and restless, with short dark hair and a way of laughing that made every room she was in feel more alive. We worked together on a ranch in Colorado for 2 years. We were friends first, the kind of friends who talk past midnight and share a comfortable silence and know each other's habits as well as their own. And then, gradually, we were something else, something neither of us named out loud for a long time, something that lived in the spaces between the practical and the personal, in the way she looked at me sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking back, in the way I kept finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in. We had 8 months of something real before I destroyed it. Not dramatically, not with any single catastrophic act. I destroyed it with silence, with my consistent, habitual, deeply practiced silence about what I was and what I felt and what I wanted. I was afraid of what numbing it would cost me in the world I lived in. I was afraid of what it would mean about who I was and how I would be seen and what would change. And while I was busy being afraid, Jessie got tired of waiting for me to be brave enough to be honest, and she left. And she was right to leave, and I moved to New Mexico 6 months later and built something quiet and tried to make peace with the fact that I had let the best thing I'd known walk out the door because I hadn't been able to say one true sentence out loud at the right moment. That was 4 years before the storm that brought Margaret Ellis to my door. The storm came on a Wednesday in late November, the kind of storm that the high desert gets maybe twice a decade, not a blizzard, not quite, but a sustained and serious snow event that turned the roads to ice and cut visibility to 30 yards and made the whole landscape into something unrecognizable. The the familiar shapes of the land buried under 2 feet of white in less than 8 hours. I had spent the morning securing the cattle and the afternoon bringing in wood and making sure the outbuildings were latched against the wind. And by early evening I was back inside with the fire going and the reasonable expectation that I was done with the outside world until the weather broke. The knock on the door came at 7:43 in the evening. I remember the time because I had just looked at the clock on the mantel and thought, if anything else needs doing today it will have to wait until morning. Then the knock, 3 knocks, not frantic but with a deliberateness that suggested a person who was using significant effort to remain controlled. I opened the door and the wind came in first and then she came in after it, a woman in a canvas coat that was soaked through, snow in her hair, her face pale with cold and with something else, something more interior than cold. She was perhaps 26, 27. She had dark eyes and a strong face and the particular quality of someone who was holding themselves together with great intention and was very close to the limit of that intention. She looked at me for a second, just long enough to register that I was not a threat, that this was a place she could stop, and then she said, "My truck went off the road about a mile back. I've been walking. I'm sorry to just appear at your door." She said it steadily with a composure that impressed me given that she was half frozen and clearly exhausted and had just knocked on a stranger's door in a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere. I said, "Come in, no other questions, just come in." She did. I got her out of the wet coat and into a dry blanket and put her in the chair nearest the fire and made coffee and did not ask her a single question while she warmed up because she did not look like a person who needed questions right now. She needed warmth and quiet and the time to stop managing whatever she was managing. I gave her those things. She held the coffee cup in both hands and stared at the fire and slowly, visibly, the rigid quality of her posture softened, the held-together quality eased, like watching a fist open. After about 20 minutes she said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course." She said, "I'm Margaret Ellis." I said, "Callum Reed, this is the Reed Ranch." She nodded. She looked at the fire. She said, "I wasn't going anywhere in particular. I mean, I was driving somewhere but I don't have a destination that's expecting me." She paused. "I just needed to be moving." I understood that. I had spent 6 months being moving once. I said, "You can stay until the roads are clear." She looked at me then, a direct look measuring. She said, "You don't know me." I said, "You walked a mile in that storm. That's enough for tonight." She slept in the spare room. I showed her to it, gave her a dry shirt and a pair of socks. Said the bathroom was across the hall, said goodnight, and that was all. I went back to the main room and sat by the fire for a while and thought about practical things, the road, the weather, the cattle, the list of things that would need attention in the morning. I did not think about the woman in the spare room. I was deliberate about not thinking about the woman in the spare room, which means I was thinking about her constantly in the specific way of not thinking about, that is its own form of attention. I went to bed at 11. I woke up at 2:15, which I sometimes do, the ranch habit of light sleeping, the alertness to sounds that are wrong. The house was quiet. The wind had dropped. I got up for water and I was passing the spare room on my way back when I heard it. Her voice, low and unguarded in sleep, the completely unmanaged sound of a person dreaming. And the word she said, the name she said, shaped clearly in the dark like something thrown into still water. "Jesse." I stopped. I stood in the hallway with the glass of water and the dark all around me and felt the name land in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of something deep. Jesse. The particular shape of that name in a stranger's mouth, in the dark, in my house, in the middle of a snowstorm in the high desert of New Mexico. 4 years of distance and one spoken syllable, and it was all right there again, not painfully, not with the acute grief it had once carried, but with the weight of something real and unfinished and never quite fully laid to rest. I stood there for a long moment. Then I went back to my room and I lay in the dark and I thought, who are you, Margaret Ellis, and what is Jesse Crane to you? She was up before me, which I did not expect. When I came into the kitchen at 5:30, she was already there in yesterday's clothes with my dry socks on her feet and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, standing at the window looking at the snow-covered land in the first gray light of morning. She had found the coffee and made a pot. She turned when she heard me and said, "I hope that's all right." I said it was fine. She handed me a cup. We stood at the window together and drank our coffee and looked at the land. 2 feet of snow, clean and absolute. The mesa in the distance, dark against the pale sky. The cattle were invisible from here, but I could see the corral fence and the tops of the outbuildings and the way the snow had drifted against the barn door, and I was already calculating the morning's work. Margaret said after a while, "It's very beautiful here." Not a small talk thing, she said it with a genuine, considered attention, like someone who had been looking at something carefully and had arrived at a conclusion. I said, "Most days." She said, "Were you born here?" I said, "Colorado. I came here 6 years ago." She said, "To start over." I looked at her. She was looking at the window, not at me. She said, "I'm sorry, that's presumptuous." I said, "No, yes, something like that." She stayed 3 days. The road stayed impassable for 2, and by the third she could have left, but she stayed anyway, and I did not ask her why because I was not ready to ask her anything that required her to tell me how she knew that name. She was a good person to have in a space. That was the first thing I understood about her, and I understood it quickly within the first day, the way you understand certain things about certain people almost immediately, through the quality of their attention and the character of their small actions. She was not a guest in the passive sense. She helped without being asked, not intrusively, not in a way that required acknowledgement, but naturally, as a person who is accustomed to making themselves useful. She saw what needed doing and did it. She brought the dishes from the table without comment. She helped me dig out the barn door on the second morning without being invited, just appeared at my side with a second shovel she had found in the outbuilding, and we worked in the cold for 2 hours side by side in the same easy shared quiet that I had known once with someone else and had not known since. She asked about the ranch, genuine questions, the kind that come from real curiosity about the cattle, about the land management, about what it was like to work alone. I answered them. I found that I liked answering them, liked the quality of her attention when I spoke, the way she listened without filling the spaces with her own observations before I had finished with mine. She was not performing interest. She was actually interested, and there is a difference that you feel immediately, and I felt it. I did not ask about Jessie, not on the first day or the second. I held the question the way you hold something fragile with care, without squeezing, aware that the wrong kind of pressure at the wrong moment would break it. On the second evening we sat by the fire after supper and she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Do you ever miss people, not anyone specific, just the fact of people, the having of them close?" I thought about it. I said, "Sometimes. I chose this for the quiet, but the quiet has its own kind of cost." She said, "What does the quiet cost?" I said, "The things that only exist in the presence of other people, being known, being witnessed." She looked at the fire. She said, "I used to have that. I used to have someone who knew me completely, and I think I took it for granted and then I was careless with it and then it was gone." She stopped. She said, "I've been driving for 3 weeks. I don't know where I'm going. I just know I can't be in the place I was." I said, "What happened?" She looked at me. It was the first time she had looked at me directly since that first assessment at the door, the full quality of her attention, and in her eyes there was something complicated and undefended and real. She said, "Have you ever loved someone and known you were right for them and known they were right for you and then made every wrong choice anyway, not out of cruelty, just out of fear, I think? Or maybe just not knowing how to be that vulnerable without losing yourself in the process?" I said, "Yes," not elaborating, just yes. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has just found unexpected company in an unexpected place. She said, "Then you know what the driving is for." I said, "It doesn't fix it." She said, "I know, but it gives you somewhere to put the feeling." On the third morning I asked her. We were at the kitchen table over coffee and the roads were passable and we both knew she could go, and I said, "Can I ask you something before you leave?" She said yes. I said, "Last night, the first night, you talked in your sleep." She went very still, not the defensive still, not the shutting down still, but the kind that means something has reached her. I said, "You said a name." She looked at her coffee cup. I said, "Jessie." The silence lasted a long time. Then she looked up at me and her expression was something I cannot fully describe, a kind of recognition mixed with something that was almost fear, not of me but of the coincidence, the specific strangeness of the universe delivering you to the one person who might know what that name meant. She said, "How do you know that name?" I said, "Because I knew her 4 years ago in Colorado." Margaret put her coffee cup down very carefully. She said, "Jessie Crane." I said, "Yes." Another silence. Then Margaret said, "Jessie is my best friend, was my best friend. I don't know which tense is right anymore." She paused. "We had a falling out 6 months ago. I said something I shouldn't have said and she said something back and we haven't spoken since. 3 weeks ago I finally admitted to myself that I needed to go find her and apologize and try to fix it. And then I was too scared to actually go, so instead I've been driving around the Southwest in a truck I nearly put in a ditch in your county." I sat with that. The particular geometry of it. Jessie Crane's best friend arrived at my door by accident and weather, carrying the same unresolved weight I had been carrying in a different form for years. I said, "Jessie lives in Colorado still." Margaret said, "Last I knew, yes, Longmont. She's working on a small horse ranch there." I said, "Is she all right?" Margaret looked at me with the careful attention she was good at. She said, "Why do you ask like that?" I said, "Because I left things badly with her too. 4 years ago, I've wondered." Margaret said, "She's all right. She's Jessie. She's always all right on the outside." She paused. "You and she left the end of the question open." I said, "We were friends," and then something more briefly. "And then I was a coward about it and she left and I moved here and that was the end of it." I said it plainly, the way I had learned to say true things, without decoration, without the performance of either pain or casualness. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "She never told me about you." I said, "I'm not surprised. I wasn't the kind of thing she would have wanted to talk about." Margaret left that afternoon. She packed her still damp coat and the small bag she'd had in the truck and she came into the kitchen where I was washing the breakfast things and she stood in the doorway for a moment and said, Thank you for this, for not asking questions when I came in and for just letting it be what it was. I said, you needed somewhere to land. She said, yes. She paused. She said, Callum, whatever you did with Jesse, whatever the cowardice was, people are allowed to grow. That's the thing about 4 years. They can either be 4 years of the same thing or they can be 4 years of becoming someone who would do it differently. I said, I'd like to think it's the second one, she said, then maybe the question is what you do with that. She drove away down the cleared road and I watched her truck until it disappeared around the bend, and then I stood on the porch in the cold for a while and felt the specific quality of a morning after something has changed, the particular atmosphere of a life in the moment after something new has entered it. I went inside and I worked and I thought about Jesse Crane and I thought about Margaret Ellis and I thought about what 4 years of the same thing and 4 years of becoming someone different actually looked like from the inside, and whether I could tell the difference from here. 3 days after Margaret left, she called. I had not expected this. I had not given her my number, but I had written it on the small notepad by the phone in the kitchen in case she needed anything on the road, and she had apparently taken it with her. She called from somewhere in southern Colorado, a rest stop off the highway, and she said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to Longmont. I said, good. She said, I'm terrified. I said, that's usually how you know it's the right thing. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, can I call you after? I don't have many people who understand this particular situation. I said, you can call me after. She called me 4 days later. She had seen Jesse. She didn't tell me everything. It wasn't mine to know everything, but she told me enough. She said it had been hard and honest and real, and that Jesse had cried and that she had cried and that they had sat in Jesse's kitchen for 4 hours and talked through all of it, the whole of the last 6 months and some of what was underneath the last 6 months, and that at the end of it something had been repaired, not completely, not yet, but in the way of the first day of actual repair, the day the real work starts. She said, she asked about you. I went very still. Jesse, she said, yes. I told her about ending up at your ranch. Margaret paused. She wasn't surprised, which surprised me. She said some people orbit each other longer than they know. I didn't have an answer to that. Margaret said, she's well, Callum, she's really well. I said, good. I said, that's genuinely good. Margaret said, is there anything you want me to tell her? The question sat in the air for a moment, then I said, tell her the 4 years were the second kind. Margaret was quiet, then she said, she'll know what that means. I said, I think she will. That was December. January came and went with its cold, clear mornings, and the work of the ranch and the specific quality of a life lived close to the land in winter, reduced to its essentials, stripped of anything unnecessary, every day a clear account of what you did and what you didn't do and how the land responded. I worked and I thought and I was, in the particular way of a person who is changing something internal, quieter than usual even for me. Margaret called again in late January. We had been talking by then with an increasing regularity that had started as the practicality of shared history and had become something else, the easy, honest conversation of two people who had recognized something in each other and were no longer performing around it. She was back in her own life in Santa Fe, working at a veterinary clinic where she had been for 2 years. She was talking to Jesse again regularly. She said this without fanfare, just as information, happier than she had been in a long time. The driving had ended. She had found, she said, what the driving had been trying to find without meaning to in a snowstorm in northern New Mexico. I did not know in January that I was falling in love with Margaret Ellis. Or rather, I knew it in the way you know things you are not yet ready to know, the way a shape is visible in the dark before you can name what the shape is. I knew that the days she called were different from the days she didn't. I knew that I looked for her name on my phone in the evenings with a hopefulness that was not casual. I knew that she was becoming, incrementally and naturally and without any dramatic announcement, one of the people in my life whose presence changed the quality of everything around it. She came back to the ranch in March. She drove up on a Saturday morning and knocked on the door 3 knocks, the same deliberate 3, the first signature I had known her by, and when I opened it she was standing in the spring sunlight with a bag over her shoulder and a bottle of wine in her hand and a look that was trying to be casual and was not quite succeeding, and she said, I was in the neighborhood. The nearest town was 35 miles away. I said, no you weren't. She said, no, I wasn't. She handed me the wine. I stepped back to let her in. We spent the weekend the way of people who have been talking for months and are now in the same physical space again. There was an adjustment period, the first few hours, where the air between us had a slightly self-conscious quality, a heightened awareness, the way air feels before weather. We walked the ranch. I showed her the pasture and the creek bed and the high point of the land where you could see the full spread of the country in every direction, 40 miles to the south, the mountains to the north, the sky doing what the sky over New Mexico does in March, which is be so relentlessly vast and blue that it stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a physical fact about the world. She walked beside me with the ease of someone who had been in this land before or who had grown up in land like it. She told me New Mexico by birth, grew up outside of Taos before her family moved north. She knew the smell of the high desert soil in March, the specific cool warm quality of the sun that far up, the sound the wind makes through dry juniper. She walked in it the way you walk in a landscape that was part of your childhood, with a different kind of attention than the tourist attention, the way of someone returning to a mother tongue. At some point in the afternoon, we were sitting on a flat rock on the high point with the whole landscape in front of us, and she said, "Do you ever think about what your life would look like if you had made different choices?" At the key moments, I said. "Which moments?" She said. "The ones where you chose quiet over honest, the ones where keeping things private cost you something." I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "I think about it the way you think about terrain that's already behind you. Not as in I wish I could go back, but as in I need to know the shape of it so I don't walk the same route again." She looked at me. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I'm trying to figure out if I'm making a different choice right now or the same choice with a different name." I said, "What's the choice?" She looked at the landscape. Then she looked at me. She said, "The choice between saying what I actually feel and choosing the comfortable version of it." The air between us changed, not dramatically. Quietly, the way significant changes tend to happen in real life, not with a thunderclap but with a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere changes before rain. I said, "What do you actually feel?" She held my gaze for a moment, those dark eyes with the full quality of their attention. She said, "I drove 4 hours to be here, that's probably a sentence." I said, "It's the beginning of one." She almost smiled. I said, "Margaret, I'm not going to be silent about this. I've been silent about things like this before and I know what it costs." I paused. "I think you are remarkable and honest, and I have been looking for your name on my phone every evening for 2 months, and if that is something you need to hear out loud, then that is the sentence." She was very still, then she said, "That's the whole sentence." I said, "That's the whole sentence." She looked at the landscape for a moment. Then she looked back at me and said, "I drove 4 hours because there is nowhere else I wanted to be today. That's mine." We sat there in the March sunlight on the high rock with the whole of northern New Mexico spread below us and the wind moving across the land and the cattle small in the distance, and the sky going on forever, and the space between us had changed into something else, something warm and unguarded and real, the way a room feels different after two people have finally said the thing that has been waiting in it. I reached over slowly and took her hand. She looked down at our hands, then up at my face. Then she turned her hand over so that our palms were together and her fingers closed around mine with a quiet, certain warmth that was entirely her, entirely that quality of deliberate honesty she brought to everything. We sat there for a long time. The wind was clean and cold. The sky was enormous. Neither of us needed to fill it with words. We went back to the house. We made dinner, the easy, companionable cooking of two people who have been in spaces together enough times that the choreography is natural. She took the vegetables and I took the stove, and we talked about things that were small and warm and ordinary, and the whole kitchen was different from every other kitchen evening I had known in 6 years on this ranch. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Because something true had been said in the sunlight on a flat rock and had made the world different from the inside. That evening by the fire, she told me things she hadn't told me before. About growing up in Taos, about her parents and the particular education of that landscape and those years. About veterinary school and why she had chosen it and what the work meant to her. About the falling out with Jesse and what had been at the bottom of it, not the surface argument but the deeper thing, the way she had not been honest with Jesse about something important and had let that dishonesty sit between them until it became a wall, and how the 3 weeks of driving had really been 3 weeks of figuring out whether she was brave enough to go tear the wall down. She told me about the things she was afraid of, not in a list, but in the way they appeared naturally in the conversation, offered without performance, as you offer things to someone you've decided to let in. I told her things too. I told her about Jesse, the full version, not the abbreviated one I had given her on the third morning. I told her about the 8 months and the silence and the cowardice and what it had cost me. I told her about the 6 months of moving after Jesse left, the driving that serves the same function as hers had, the going somewhere that is really a going away from something. I told her about what New Mexico had become, not a retreat but a decision, a choice to build something honest even if that something was quiet. She listened the way she always listened, with the full quality of her attention, and when I was done she said, "Thank you for telling me that." I said, "It's the true version." She said, "I know, that's why." She left Sunday afternoon. I walked her to her truck. The sky was the particular blue of a New Mexico Sunday, deep and clean. She put her bag in the back and turned, and we were standing close in the way of people who have said true things to each other and are now inhabiting the truth physically. The closeness not awkward but natural, the kind of closeness that has arrived at itself through honesty rather than performance. She looked up at me with those dark eyes and said, "I'll come back." I said, "I know." She said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I said, I'll be here. She put her hand briefly on my chest, just that, just one moment of her palm against the front of my jacket, warm and deliberate, and then she got in the truck and drove away, and I stood on the porch and watched until the road took her around the bend. She came back in 3 weeks, then 2. Then she was driving up on Friday afternoons and leaving Monday mornings, and the rhythm of it became the rhythm of my life with a naturalness that was not complicated to explain. It was right. It fit the way right things fit, without requiring constant adjustment, without the sense of something forced into a shape it doesn't belong in. She brought books and she brought her work reports that she did on Sunday mornings at my kitchen table. And she brought the particular quality of her presence that had, by now, become as much a part of the Reed Ranch as the sky or the cattle or the way the creek bed sounded in spring. She had a gentleness with the horses that reminded me, in the best possible way, of Wren, a woman I had known years ago who had the same quality, that same ability to enter an animal's trust through patience and steadiness. She spent time in the barn without needing a reason, just for the being with them, talking to them in her low, unhurried way. The horses responded to her as they respond to the specific kind of person who comes to them without agenda. I watched this from the barn door sometimes without her knowing, watched her with the gray gelding that had been difficult since I got him, watched her patient and quiet and entirely present, and felt something in my chest that was not complicated and not ambiguous and did not require careful management. It was not without difficulty. I want to be honest about that, because love that presents itself as entirely uncomplicated is usually a love that hasn't been tested yet, and ours had its tests in those first months. She had a history of making herself small in relationships, not romantically, not submissively, but in the specific way of someone who has learned that the easiest way to maintain connection is to not need too much from it, to keep your own requirements quiet so that you don't become a burden. I had a history of silence, of keeping the real thing private and offering the managed version, of choosing the comfortable absence of disclosure over the uncomfortable presence of truth. These histories did not vanish because we had been honest with each other on a flat rock in March. They surfaced, they showed up in specific moments and required specific work. The first real conflict came in May. She had been at the ranch for a long weekend, and on Sunday evening something happened, a small thing. The kind of small thing that is really a symptom of something larger. I had been quieter than usual all weekend, and she had noticed and had not said anything in the way of her learned smallness, and I had not explained in the way of my learned silence, and by Sunday evening the unexplained quiet had taken up enough space that the air in the kitchen felt different. She was washing dishes and I was drying, and she said, without looking at me, "You've been somewhere else all weekend." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't apologize, just tell me where you were." I put down the dish towel. I said, "I heard from someone last week, a contractor I worked with a few years ago, someone who knew me in Colorado. He said some things about me, about who I am, old things, things I thought were behind me." I paused. It stirred up stuff I thought I had dealt with, and I've been inside it all weekend and I didn't know how to bring it in. She dried her hands and turned to face me. She said, "Callum, you're allowed to bring things in, that's what I'm here for." I said, "I know," she said. "Do you? Because the not bringing it in is a pattern I'm familiar with, and I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere just because something is hard." I said, "I know that, I think I know that, but knowing it and trusting it are different distances." She said, "Then let's work on the distance." We talked for 3 hours that night, not just about the contractor and the old things he had stirred up, but about the larger landscape, about what I was and what that had cost me in the world I had come from, about the silences I had learned and why I had learned them, about the specific shape of my fear of being fully known in all the ways I was. It was the hardest conversation we had had. It was also the most important one because it went past the surface into the actual terrain, and Margaret received everything I said with the same quality of attention she brought to the horses, the same patient and completely present stillness that said, "I see you, all of it, and I am not moving." She told me things too in return. About her own fears, about the way she had loved people in the past and managed it badly, about the specific kind of grief that comes when you know you were careless with someone who deserved better. About Jesse and what the falling out had really been about, not the surface argument but the thing beneath it, which was that Margaret had hidden something from Jesse for months out of fear of Jesse's reaction, and Jesse had found out. And the injury had been to trust as much as to the specific thing. She said, "I've spent my whole adult life trying to be the kind of person nobody needs to worry about, so I make myself easier than I am, I make my needs smaller, and then eventually something gets too big to hide and it comes out wrong." She looked at me. "I don't want to do that here." I said, "I don't want you to do that here." She said, "Then we're going to have to keep talking, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." I said, "I can do that." She said, "I know, that's why I'm saying it to you and not to anyone else." Summer came to the ranch the way it always did, in a slow and golden accumulation that turned the dry grass the color of the light and made the evenings long and warm and full. Margaret and I built a life that summer in the particular way that two careful, honest people build things, gradually, with attention, without rushing the parts that needed time. There was a rhythm to her weekends on the ranch that had become as natural as anything: the Friday afternoon arrival, the sound of her truck on the gravel road, the way the light in the house changed when she was in it. The horses had accepted her in the complete and unambiguous way they accept people they've decided to trust. Junie, the gray gelding who had been difficult since I got him, now came to the fence when he heard her voice. She brought her veterinary kit one Saturday in June, and we spent the afternoon doing a full check on all 12 animals, working together in the barn with the easy competence of people who know each other's way of doing things. She was methodical and gentle and very good, and watching her work, watching the full quality of her skill and her care, I felt the particular kind of love that comes not from the dramatic moments but from the ordinary ones, from seeing someone fully in the work of their daily life and finding them extraordinary in exactly that. I told her so, sitting on the gate afterward, both of us warm and tired and satisfied with the afternoon. She looked at me with an expression I had come to know, slightly surprised by the directness of it, slightly moved, and then the warm settling of it landing. She said, "You can just say things, you know that, you're allowed to just say them." I said, "I'm practicing." She said, "You're good at it." I said, "I have good incentive." In August she told me she was thinking about Santa Fe differently. Not critically, she liked her work and her clinic and her city apartment with its courtyard garden, but differently. She said, "I keep noticing what I'm driving toward on Fridays more than what I'm leaving behind." She said this carefully, without pressure, offering it as information rather than requirement. I said, "Is that a question or a statement?" She said, "Somewhere between the two." I said, "Then let me say something that's fully a statement." She waited. I said, "I have been building something quiet here for 6 years. I built it to be mine, to require nothing of anyone except the work itself. And then a woman arrived in a snowstorm and I let her in without asking a single question because something in the way she knocked on my door told me she was the kind of person it was right to let in. And since then this place has been different, not louder, not more complicated. Just fuller, like a room that found the last thing it was missing." I paused. "Whatever pace you need, Margaret, but I'm not going to pretend I wouldn't want you here." She was very quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something I've been holding for a while and haven't known how to say." I waited. She said, "When I first got here, the night I arrived, I had a dream and I talked in my sleep and you heard the name." I said, "Jessie?" She said, "Yes, and here is the thing I've been holding. Jessie knew about you. She told me about you after I came back from Longmont. She told me about the Colorado ranch and the 8 months and the cowardice, as you called it, and what it had cost her. And she said," Margaret stopped, started again. "She said, if you ever meet a man named Callum Reed, be patient with him. He's still learning how to stay." She paused. "That's what she said. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know where I was going when I was driving. And then I ended up at your door in a snowstorm and you let me in without asking a single question, and the next morning you made me coffee and I thought, this is the kind of person Jessie was describing, without knowing it was you." I sat with that for a long time. Jessie Crane, 400 miles away on a horse ranch in Colorado, who had left because I hadn't been brave enough to stay, who had told her best friend to be patient with a man she didn't yet know was the same man. The specific and extraordinary geometry of it. The way things return and resolve and offer you, sometimes, a second architecture with different materials. A chance to build the thing you failed at the first time with the person who was somehow always meant to be at the center of it. I said, "She always understood things before I did." Margaret said, "She's very perceptive." I said, will you tell her that the learning is done, that I know how to stay now?" Margaret looked at me with those dark eyes, warm and direct and completely present. She said, "I think she probably already knows, but yes, I'll tell her." She moved to the ranch in September. Not all at once. She kept her clinic in Santa Fe, drove down 3 days a week, kept the rhythm of her work life intact. But her things were here, her books were here, her veterinary kit was in the barn, her coffee cup was in the cabinet to the left of the stove. Junie the gray gelding looked for her every morning and found her, which seemed like the most reliable evidence of all. The first morning she was officially, fully here, we stood at the kitchen window before dawn the way we had stood the first morning after the storm, in the early gray light with the coffee, looking at the land. 2 feet of snow had become the high September grass of late summer, golden and warm in the first light. The mesa in the distance, the cattle in the far pasture, the sky beginning to go from dark blue to something more complicated and beautiful. She said after a while, "It's still very beautiful here." I said, "Every day." She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, just for a moment, just that, the warm, simple weight of it, and then straightened and looked back out at the land. Her land now, ours. I put my arm around her and we stood there and watched the morning come in over the Reed Ranch, and the sky went on forever the way it always had. And for the first time in a very long time, the forever of it felt not like distance but like room. Room for the life we were building. Room for the people we were becoming. Room for all the honest, imperfect, ordinary, extraordinary days that were coming one after another in the high desert light. Jessie Crane sent a card in October. No letter, just a card, a plain card with a mountain on it, and inside in her handwriting, "Glad you both finally got there." 3 words. I put it on the mantel next to the clock. Margaret saw it and smiled in the way of someone receiving exactly what they needed from exactly the right distance. She said, "That's very Jessie." I said, "Yes." She said, "We should have her out sometime, when it feels right." I said, "When it feels right." The ranch was full in a way it had never been. Not louder, not more complicated, just full. The way a chest feels when it has finally, after a long time of careful management and learned silence and chosen quiet, been allowed to open completely and found in the opening that it had more room than it had ever known. That is the whole story. Everything before it was the winter that made the spring possible, the silence that made the saying of the true thing finally, completely, undeniably necessary. The name whispered in the dark was the beginning, and the beginning was a gift, and the gift was not what I expected it to be, which is how the best gifts always arrive. She is in the barn right now. I can hear her talking to Junie in that low, unhurried way. The coffee is on. The morning is coming in over the mesa. The land is the same land it has always been, demanding and beautiful and indifferent in the way that is its own kind of comfort. I am not building something quiet anymore. I am building something true. And that finally, after everything, is enough.